But I want to start with a short story, if I can. Some of you know the name Randy Sorensen, who was a psychoanalyst and very interested in what he'd call minding spirituality. He was a spiritually integrated psychotherapist for sure. And he talked a lot about alterity, creating space for the other. And he tells this wonderful story about being in an analytic session, and he was kind of giving this brilliant interpretation and kind of going on, and he finished, and the patient said, "You know, while you were talking, I was thinking." Just sort of completely had nothing to do with what he was saying, but it was sort of a lovely, point of alterity, and we would suspect, right, that there probably was something that he said that in fact did create thinking, or some things he had said in some ways that he had been previous to that moment that had also done something similar in the patient's mind. But so we kind of want to begin with this sort of slightly odd question. I don't know if it's odd or not for a bunch of therapists particularly, but as you've been listening to one another, what have you been thinking about? Yes, we have a taker.
I just want to add to that. I think there was a lot of thinking, but in addition to that, I found myself with a lot of feeling. I think I wanted to just add that.
So what have you been feeling, or what have you been thinking?
It was a feeling of privilege and feeling what an honor it is really to be in this space, that I get to be in psychoanalytic spaces, I get to be in my faith-based spaces, but to hold the both of them together here and then have multiple perspectives and beautifully thought out ways of thinking and applying these theoretical frameworks in terms of their work. What a privilege to be in a space where you can have all of that and respect and for each other's ways of thinking and space and openness and receptivity. That combines the feeling and the thought, I think.
I also felt just a tremendous sense of gratitude to be, I was mentioning to some people yesterday, of gratitude to be, and it felt like kind of a home base, where that's not a common feeling I have in mainstream psychology, and this is not mainstream psychology. So to be around people who you don't have to kind of justify why this is important, to do all the basic work of saying this is meaningful and kind of defend ourselves, it was a relief, and it was good to be with people like that. At the same time, the other piece of this I was grateful for was there was a level of personal disclosure here that's not common, and I thank Steve and Brad for setting this up that way, because you designed this with some of those questions of, okay, what is your own background and heritage? What do you bring to the therapeutic relationship? And I don't have answers to that. I think that's one of the ways we differ, of what do we share of ourselves, how much do we share, and what do we share with each other professionally, what do we share, how much do we share with our clients in context. And I think we would probably all agree that there is no simple answer to that's got to be as much a clinical a judgment as anything else. But I'm glad that we've begun to have that dialogue. I think it's just a beginning, though, and I think it needs a lot more elaboration because there's so much potential for gain and growth that we've all talked about. I think in some ways relational spirituality and the therapeutic relationship is pivotal to that. So in sharing of ourselves, that may be one of the keys to development and helping the client. On the other hand, I think it's potentially risky because of our positions of power. And at what point do we say, well, that's not appropriate, and we may be misusing our power in subtle ways, imposing a perspective on clients that's not theirs and may ultimately not be helpful to them. Or even if it is helpful to them, do we have any right to be doing that? So those are some of the questions that came up for me.
I can add. I agree with everything that Shamila and Ken have said. I also was struck by the difference in language that was used at this particular conference than many other spaces that I'm in. It's interesting to have us talk about things like love and compassion, and it's interesting for me with psychology language these days because it's so much of it focuses on words like empathy, but then you're supposed to stay away from love, and which is really problematic in my view, because I remember I was thinking a lot about my supervision during my graduate school years, and then never using words like love and compassion, but then moving to Cambridge and having a particular supervisor who was very open to his own spirituality. And he would say things like, do you like your client? Do you like your patient? Do you love this person? It sounds like, there's love there. And he was the first person who really engaged with that aspect and spoke in that kind of language. So for me, it felt really good to come back to some of that language, because I do think that that's more at the heart of, our human experience. So that was really refreshing.
Do I need to bring that closer? I might just add to what's already been said, and this is very connected to what you were just saying, that I've been reflecting on how much reality we've been holding together, and that reality it's inclusive of so many different facets of our experience, right? The human condition, not to mention the complexity of clinical work and the complexity of a spiritual practice and a religious life, but it just feels like it's been a very roomy holding environment here with a strong heart space. I've also had a lot of feeling, which I think has something to do again with Merle Jordan and his spirit here, which I felt yesterday, and just the integrity of my colleagues and all who are present. So.
I have about 100 thoughts running through my head at the same time, so I'll try to be coherent. But one thing I would like to agree with my colleagues. I have felt so much compassion being expressed. I mean, there are a lot of ways that we can hear one another's ideas. Respect is one. We can receive someone's offering with respect. But what I found in myself is when I would hear something that wouldn't naturally come to my mind, looking back, I realized there was a space from the very beginning created or opened up in me to receive it with compassion, and not what I mean by compassion is love or as a gift, rather than in some settings where I'm sort of deconstructing the position or, but to just receive it. That's been really wonderful. And I do think I do a lot of ritual process in my classes. So I've been thinking about the way the invitation came to participate. And I remember when Steve first sent me the email, I sent back a title. I won't tell you the title of it because it was like a dissertation title, I think there were 2 colons in it or whatever. And then later I thought, wait a minute, this is the Danielson. I can actually, so you notice that my paper actually didn't represent that, I don't know what that thing was I sent you first. But what I want to say is that in addition to compassion, I feel gratitude for the way in which the process from beginning to this point was a welcoming, inviting, and this is where the ritual process part comes in, sort of initiating, creating a liminal space here that's initiating and inviting us, forming us for when we leave here. I pulled up 2 of my syllabi and for spring and then in the fall, and made changes in them because, anyway.
For me, it's really been a pleasure to be able to relax into this. Traditionally, in psychological circles, you never really know what you're going into when you speak about religion. You don't know how you're going to be received. Here, it felt very warm, welcoming, and easy. And I appreciate that. And I think that the field is changing. I think we are making room for spiritual experience and to be inclusive of people who have spiritual experiences. And I think that's really important. And in listening, unfortunately, I was only here today, so I only heard Shamila. But in listening to Shamila's talk, it really became clear to me that the work that we're doing is incredibly meaningful. And I think we should stop a moment and just recognize that.
I think you all have mentioned some of the uniqueness of this experience. One of the questions that Brad and I had wondered about, and we think around Danielson about, is it might be interesting to hear you reflect on this. Do you have other spaces where you can engage in some of this kind of conversation and connect around it? If so, it would be interesting to hear how that works out for you or where you find that. Or if not, are there ways that you could imagine wanting to try to do more of this? Some of what intrigues us is how do we create ongoing spaces for this? Where can people find colleagues and conversations that allow for this? And one of the things we've enjoyed about the diversity of the panel is that some of you are from similar professional networks or guilds, but you're from different disciplines and guilds. And so this is an opportunity to sort of compare notes on, are you finding places for these conversations or not? And what would that look like?
I can start. I find that I can talk about certain aspects of this realm of spirituality and diversity more broadly, but not in a completely integrated way, and not sort of holding various aspects and dimensions in the same space. And so it's interesting, even within the American Psychological Association, I used to belong to like 10 different divisions, just because it wasn't because I really thought I should belong to 10 different divisions, but rather my interests and myself in relation to those interests became so fragmented. And it's sort of like, okay, I'll go to the ethnic minority psychology division for this, and I'll go to psychoanalysis for that, and trauma for something else. And, in a sense, I feel like the structures that we work in are set up that way. And they kind of fragment us into these silos, and then our thinking can also become like that, to mirror that. And so I find that actually a real struggle. It's not easy. So I think I find more integration in my personal life than I do in my professional life.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
I feel the same way. I don't really think that there is another space where I would normally have this kind of a conversation. Even though psychoanalysis, which is the field that I identify with most closely, has changed, there's still a skepticism, I think, toward religion and spirituality. I'll share an anecdote. When I first was going to start psychoanalytic training at NYU postdoc, I was having lunch with a colleague who's a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst at Columbia Psychoanalytic, and Columbia Psychoanalytic is very conservative. And so we're having lunch, and we're in the cafeteria, and I say, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead for the salad bar because I keep kosher. So I'll have the most options here. And he said, without missing a beat, he said, oh, don't worry, we'll psychoanalyze that out of you. Yeah.
When I started this many years ago in my own work, 1975, I remember telling myself this is really a good field for introverts. Because there really was there was no place to go for social connection around integration of religion and mental health and psychotherapy. The meetings I went to, there was virtually no one there who had interest in it, and it was okay because I am introverted and I survived it. It's changed some, and I've been really fortunate to get support largely from my grad students over the years, where I was able to create a ongoing research clinical team that was very meaningful to me. And then in later years, doing workshops on spirituality and psychotherapy, they're also tremendously meaningful to me, but it's feast or famine. In going out to a workshop where then you find like-minded people, and not just like-minded people, but mental health professionals or chaplains who are also eager for training in this area, just hungry and just passionate about what we're doing here and wanting to learn more because they feel so like such a deficit in knowing what to do. But you go from that kind of a meeting and then you leave, and it's famine for however long till the next interchange. And again, so I think it's still somewhat of a good place for introverts, unless you are fortunately part of an institute like the Danielson where there are more like-minded people.
So I think part of me going back and forth between different spaces literally is about that, because one space cannot hold it all. So you keep shifting between places to meet the different needs of the parts of yourself. The whole self is not held in one. And I was reflecting on what you said, maybe in the personal, but I recognize it's not even there. Coming from where I come from, even the field of psychology is such a question mark. Like, how do you even bring your professional self into that personal space? So they're parts of the self that are met in different settings. Some settings hold more parts, some less parts, but it's always parts and never the whole fully. And this, I think I mentioned the Center for Multicultural Training in Psychology. I feel like that's a place that holds a lot of the parts for me, where I can have conversations about different aspects of my identity. But even there, the spiritual aspect is somewhat lacking, reflective of the field. But for the psychoanalytic part of it, I go to Division 39 to have those conversations. So I think, I remember doing the dissertation and I wanted people from different departments on my committee. And that there being a question of like, what, this is psychoanalytic program. So I eventually advocated for it, got somebody from the art department and the sociology department. But it was reflective and symbolic of the fact that what I was writing about couldn't fit in one in my head. So that continues to be the case.
once again, I'm identifying strongly with everything that I'm hearing. Even though I feel I've been very blessed to have different communities that hold a lot and hold a lot of otherness. I'm part of an institute that's primarily made up of Buddhist clinicians, and I did my PhD at basically a Christian seminary in the Department of Psychiatry and Religion. And yet, there's often the sense of something that feels very pressing to me and immediately relevant to the conversation that's not being recognized. So at this Institute of Buddhist Clinicians, we don't get to learn from people who practice other traditions. And I was so struck by certain refrains that I was aware of throughout the weekend of different traditions just holding more space for more affect than, unless you're a great tantric master, typically in the Buddha Dharma, we're really looking, Miriam and I were talking about this, to come to a very centered, very contained place. And so important, right, for me to hear from you. You don't have to be centered, right, to carry on. Maybe it's important to be destabilized or off-centered or filled with affect, and work with it skillfully, but still. So even though I feel like I have been afforded these extraordinary places, it is tough to find, an environment where we can hold as much as we have here.
I'm thinking of the poet Pat Parker, Black lesbian poet, who one of her poems said, when I can find a place where I can bring all the parts of me into the room and not have one part saying, this is a place for lesbians, not black folks, or this is a place for black folks, but not lesbians. It's just, she said, when I can bring all those parts into the room, then I think we'll have a revolution. So, yes, I'm still waiting for the revolution. But the question makes me realize how the longing for the space is also a part of the transformation of me, not necessarily the fields, the disciplines, but something about the longing pulls something out of me. Only the longing would make me present the paper that I presented, rather than that research thing I think I was going to present. What I mean by that, there's like a magnet that pulls us in one direction, and then when the invitation comes, it sort of makes us, at least makes me, more aware of what I long for, and makes me fantasize the ways in which I can be a part of its creation. So.
Let me ask another question. This may be one that needs further reflection, but maybe something has occurred to you over the course of the last couple days, because it has for me. I think another wish that we wanted to have people experience was that to speak from one's tradition is not to nullify the other, right? And that in fact, speaking from our tradition and hearing others speak from their tradition could enrich my own tradition. And so I've reflected on even how in Ken's work and in some of the psychology of religion, science has used the term sanctification, very, very different from the way that my tradition uses that term. But it's helped me reflect back on ways in which the way my tradition uses that term could be enlarged if I were to interact with the way Ken's been using it. And so I'm wondering, as you've been listening again to one another and feeling and listening and thinking, is there anything that you've heard that is kind of taking you back to your thoughts, to your own tradition, to wonder about? Phyllis, you already said you're adjusting your syllabi. or might make you do your paper differently, or is that, I don't know if there's something that jumps out at you.
You know, I think that's a complicated question, because even if I just think about my tradition, well, what does that even mean? Is it Judaism? Is it Orthodox Judaism, which is what I grew up with at school? Is it sort of a traditional Judaism, which I grew up with at home? Is it ultra Orthodox Judaism, which is I grew up with my extended family? I have multiple self-states when it comes to religion. I literally have different names. I'm Karen I wasn't even called Karen at home, but I won't go into that. But Karen in my public life, but when I went to visit my grandmother and stayed with my aunts and uncles, my name was Chaya. Chaya is my Hebrew name, and my name was Chayala, and I only wore skirts. Now, in that world, I'm barely even Jewish, right? I belong to the Reconstructionist Synagogue, which is an extremely progressive Jewish movement. I sit at synagogue and I think to myself, I'm not really a Reconstructionist.
That's a great example, though, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
For me, I have so many thoughts and ways that everybody has impacted my own thinking. But one thing that stands out to me, and it has come up over and over again over the last couple of days, is this idea, I think, that Lisa this morning pointed out around spiritual messengers. And I kept sort of thinking about that, even in relation to our earlier conversation about psychology and who are the messengers involved with, the narratives that we create about the role of spirituality in psychotherapy. But I also thought about it in terms of Hinduism around, sort of creating an understanding of personal spirituality and who those messengers might be. And what does that mean in our larger world right now, in our country right now, in the United States, where I think it was the very first question after Ken's talk yesterday that was posed around this angst that we feel being in this nation right now. And what do you do? Who are the messengers of this broader, more open spirituality and thinking openly? And it just feels, I feel a whole bunch of things about that. And, so I think it's sort of helping me just deepen perhaps what I will write more about and what I will think a lot more about. And so I'm really grateful for that.
I was somewhat surprised, but also really informed and I don't know. I think I learned something here and hearing the other speakers generally, that even though I'm not psychodynamically oriented myself, even though I find value in a lot of psychodynamic thoughts. But when I think of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic thoughts, I think of it as a very intellectual, word, hearing-oriented approach, very cognitive. And so I think deep down I had this concern that this might be a little bit intellectually focused and even boring. And there was certainly a lot of concepts presented. And yet I found that, to me, what was the most powerful and engaging was not the insights that were described here that clients made. I didn't hear a whole lot about aha experiences that transformed clients' lives. I didn't hear many examples of that at all. What I heard that was truly transformational were these experiential moments, and they may have come from some practice of that was derived from a tradition, or they may have come from something that happened in the therapy, talking about with Jonah, talking about his political philosophy, or experiences that people described, or moments of deep connection with the therapist that I heard that were really quite transformational. Or I'm thinking about Lisa Miller's love table visualization, that the experience, and I think some of these experiences do have some kind of spiritual religious base to them or point of connection, and that was the source of transformation. And somehow that comes out of a psychodynamic perspective, but also the religious perspectives. And so to me, there's some kind of message in that, maybe regardless of therapeutic orientation, I tend to be pretty eclectic myself, but one of the most important vehicles for change, and one of the ways that spiritually integrated therapy, one of its core ingredients, may in fact be the kinds of experiential moments that can be drawn from traditions, or drawn from the therapeutic encounter that has an inherent spirituality to it, and that if we kind of blow on that spark, the spiritual connection between client and therapist, that also can produce transformation and change. So.
I remember listening to everybody and thinking, oh, that's a great concept. Oh, that's one. I don't know about that. But I could not name any of them right now. But what I could say is that it left me with this feeling. So the concepts are objective and whatnot, but like this feeling, the subjective state of wanting to be connected. And I think said it to multiple people on the panel multiple times. Like, I hope we stay connected. I hope we stay connected. So it's those holders of those concepts, but what they bring and how they bring their explanation or their sense of it, that the notions don't necessarily capture them in themselves by themselves. Or there's a way in which how each notion is explained that could be very different than somebody else explaining that same idea to me. So in the end, I wrote those ideas down, but felt detached from them and attached to them only through the people who conveyed them. So hence the desire to stay connected to all of them.
I probably don't have the question that you actually asked totally clear in my head, but my free association is I was just thinking about when the Pulse massacre happened, and I went to Orlando and met with a black open and affirming church there. And I actually didn't know what I was being asked to do. I was asked to come and provide pastoral care. And I really did not know what I was going to do. But when one of the things, when I was there, I met with everybody from the church in a big circle, and people, of course, had all kinds of things to talk about, not only what happened, but what it evoked in them, whether or not their families who had called to see if they were okay, and what was reactivated in them in terms of their families and loved ones. And one of the things that was asked of me after the second group, someone said, how long are you going to be here? What are you leaving tomorrow? And I think I was there 4 days, I think. And I really didn't know what to say, because I had been invited not by the pastor, and I couldn't tell the way that they operated. I was suddenly thrust. And so I looked at the pastor and I said, well, that depends on the pastor, who then wasn't quite sure what she could ask. All of that led me to think about today and yesterday, how often each of us referenced what was going on in the world and where our feet are planted in between the individual work we do the teaching work we do, and what we do in service of what's going on in the world. And one of the things that always came to my mind during my psychoanalytic training, as much as we all believed in psychoanalytic theory and its power to change, having the conversation of change as it relates to outside the door of our office. Either, most of the time it wasn't happening, couldn't happen, and the conviction didn't carry outside the door. And I heard so much of that here. It was very inspiring to hear others.
It's nice to get to reflect with you on your experience of this. I'm sort of aware that, kind of like Lisa was saying about education, I sort of wonder what professional conferences do to us who go to them. You know, that they're often enriching for me, but I often find myself breezing in and breezing out, and it often feels like probably the idea that I had after my talk was the most valuable one to some, but there's no space really to process that or hold on to it. And so I really appreciate how much you've each shared of yourselves, and that we get a chance to reflect a little bit on the process of being together around these issues, and to think about perhaps what would it be like to do that sort of thing more often or in other ways for many of us. So thank you for that.
I just had one other thought,
Yeah.
and it relates to your question to me about suffering. And you know, there is a lot of suffering in the world, and religion, I think, in many ways is a response to suffering. It's our way of making meaning of suffering, and our job as therapists is to deal with suffering. And I think in those ways, we're really just both. You know, if you think of it, you know, what is religion and spirituality about, and what is our work about as therapists? It's to address the reality of suffering in the world.
Yeah, thank you. Should we open it up? Yeah.
All right, well, we're going to open it up to you all now at this point. For you, your questions, your comments, and I'm going to let you respond to the same question that I asked the panel at the beginning. As you've been listening, what have you been thinking? So you might just want to make a short, not another lecture. We've had lots of lectures, but you may have a reflection that you've been thinking about, or again, it could be a question aimed at the whole panel, or maybe one particular speaker as well. So we have, I guess oh, you have a mic too? Okay, perfect. We got 2 mics. There you go.
Thank you. I've been thinking and spoke with Dr. Usha a little bit about this earlier, about the context in which so much of this plays out, and meaning we have so many insights and examples of helpful elements of faith traditions and insights that we can have and apply, particularly in therapeutic environment. And it stands out to me that so much of what we experience and what this operates within is a lot of mixed messages, and that is mixed messages that we receive from our culture, from our institutions, from our family systems, and how complex it becomes to want to address and foster a positive sense of faith within the difficulty of when we receive both positive and negative messages from the same source. For example, that religion can make meaning of suffering, and religion can also be the perpetrator of so much suffering as well. And sort of in that context, what we do with that, and it seems to me the challenge, one of the many challenges, is being able to discern the helpful, healthy, positive, strengthening, protective factors and the negative ones, and oftentimes they're delivered simultaneously in our lives. And I wondered if that might spur any thoughts or responses from your own work and your own experience of when we're dealing with both at the same time.
In my later years as a therapist, I came across a image online, and I pursued it. It's an image of Japanese ceramic art called kintsugi. Kintsugi is based on a philosophy of the art of creating wholeness through brokenness. And kintsugi is a form of ceramics art where a piece of ceramics is broken, shattered, like the shattered vessel, and then it's pieced back together again with gold or silver filigree to create something whole. But it's whole, and the brokenness is clearly apparent. And in some ways, the broken work of art that's become whole is more beautiful, I find, than the perfect work of art, as you were suggesting. I found that metaphor, or that form of art, to be tremendously helpful in coming to terms with paradoxical, contradictory, the dilemmas of life that include both our capacity for elevated experience and the greatest of potentials, and also the potential for incredible harm that we inflict on each other. And how do we hold that simultaneously in thinking about our culture, but also thinking about ourselves? Because I do think that we each carry that potential, not only for elevation, but the potential, the seeds of destruction and evil lie within us too. So how do you hold that? And can you be whole and live a life of well-being and flourishing, holding on to that? Serena Wong and I wrote a paper on this about wholeness and holiness, because they're both etymologically connected, wholeness and holiness and healing. And how do you move to greater wholeness in life? As I think about it, that's the major life task.
I really appreciated speaking with you, Rick, earlier about this this question of, how do you hold both the negative and the positive messages? I actually think it's more common to have that than just the positive stuff. That I think it's very common in all of our socialization to kind of receive these mixed messages. And sometimes they're not just about faith, but they're mixed with race and culture and gender and sexual identity, so many things. And it's sort of like, I think that, as we're talking about how this conference is a particular type of holding space, maybe for us to recognize some of the negativity that has been kind of directed at looking at spirituality within psychology. I think it's important to figure out how to access those spaces of recognition, of what those wounds or those negative messages were related to our personal spirituality maybe, or what we learned in our families, or the messages that are out there in terms of whether it's anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or all of that stuff that gets absorbed constantly. But I think there's just, I don't know how else to do that, and I think just having any kind of space to have that be recognized in a real way becomes so important.
This exchange just made me think of this comment one of my mentors, Dr. Orlando Lightfoot, would make when I would ask questions as such, and he would say, don't hold the complexity, let the complexity hold you.
I want to say to all of you how grateful I am. I've learned a great deal here these last couple days, but even more, I've felt a great deal. And I wasn't sure what was really going on until I went home and got some nice introvert time last night at the hotel, and realized that a lot of the conference was like sitting with Merle. I must say to you, the way all of you have described this, it's a place with a strong heart space, where personal disclosure is respected, where words like love and compassion are accepted as in part of the psychological world. We talked about reception and deconstruction and how easy it was to be much more receptive here. That push towards integration, it has really been for me, like sitting with him. And what kept coming back to me last night was this one clinical piece. I was struggling with a client that I couldn't make heads nor tail of. He was 17 years old. He couldn't finish he would not finish high school. He was 2 months shy and would not go. And I had no idea what to do. And when I went into Merle for supervision after about a month of this, he said to me, find out what this kid loves. What is it that he loves? Don't try to figure out what he ought to be doing or how to move him forward. Find out what he loves. And so I went into the next session, and he had brought in a backpack with him, and I noticed a comic book sticking out of his backpack. And I said, so do you read comic books? He said, oh yeah. You know, and the eyes lit up, and I said, well, tell me about who's your favorite comic book character? And he said, Iron Man. I said, well, tell me about Iron Man. I don't know much about him. When I was reading comic books, it was all Superman and Batman. And he smiled, and he started to talk about Iron Man as this person who was a hero because he found out something had happened to him, and he had to be encased in metal to preserve his life and to live in the world. And at that moment, the light went off in my head, and we found out he was describing his alcoholic father. And it really opened up a whole world for him. And I came back and I told Merle this. He just sat there smiling. That picture out here where that was him. So thank you for helping me recapture some of that.
I also want to say thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to listen across the different traditions and hear all of the commonalities. This is maybe more of an observation, and I'm sitting with the question of it, and it feels like the answer should be obvious, but somehow it's not. I think it's more complex. So I will share what I've been thinking is that much of the discussion has been about different traditions, but very similar expressions within each tradition, because there's been a contemplative or a mystical or an inward-facing component of each tradition that's been discussed. And psychoanalysis or psychodynamic work is, by its very nature, that introspective turn to the inward life and the dynamics of relationships. So what I'm left with is, what do we do with the center of these traditions? How do we sit with clients who don't express themselves or don't have in their repertoire that more mystical or contemplative side, where it's a more traditional, centered inside the tradition expression of religion or spirituality? I'm sort of sitting with, how do we bring them into the psychodynamic fold in some way? Or how do we sit with someone who, when we have that contemplative side and that mystical turn, and we value that so much in our work, both from a religious perspective and from a psychological perspective, how do we be with that, with someone who doesn't have that value as well, or doesn't live that value at least?
Go ahead. I don't know that I see it as my work to bring someone into a fold, particularly when it comes to religion and spirituality. And I'm thinking of, I had a colleague here at BU who, Kirk, and he would say, I'm religious, I'm not spiritual. And some of what he meant by that, I think, is that the practice of going to church was what was important to him. The relationships at church were important to him. The liturgy was important to him, but not in a contemplative or even mystical sense. But it did frame one of the ways in which he thought about life. And I found that very helpful for that way of thinking about the contemplative or the mystical or the interiority of experience compared with, he didn't use this language, but the way I would think about it is the ethical, that I experienced, the ethical obligation to plant my feet someplace Sunday morning or on Wednesday. I have a little rule: if I don't go to church on Sunday, I go to chapel on Wednesday. It brings to mind the embodied nature, in a practice sort of sense, of going, joining, doing what is done in a particular tradition. So I think the point of it is, the point of what I do with people is to help them be able to be meaningfully in the world and in their lives. And they don't have to do it the way I do it, or even the way that I find meaningful to me. I've had patients who come in as atheists and they leave as atheists. And they leave more able to be in the world in wonderful ways and contribute. And I think that's the bottom line for me, that they're able to engage more.
I'm thinking about Usha's presentation and the importance of the language of pathways within Hinduism. I found it very valuable. And pathway is a term, a metaphor that's found almost universally across traditions in Buddhism and Hinduism. You can find it just about any tradition, but it's so important because it suggests that we take different pathways. We're not all taking the same pathway. For some people, the contemplation pathway, the pathway of practice doesn't work for them. For them, it may be purely intellect. For other people, it's a pathway of relationship. And for other people, it may be pathways of emotional experience. And they're all okay, but sometimes the pathway can get blocked, or it becomes too narrow. And so you need to do some work reconstructing the pathway, broadening and deepening the pathway maybe. And sometimes the destination is the problem. That the pathway may be okay, but it's not taking the person where they need, or where they not need, but where they may want to go. Sometimes the destination may be a real dead end or a destructive destination. So thinking in terms of kind of life is a journey, and with pathways and destinations, and understanding the road each client is taking and helping them along their path, which is going to be unique, to be distinctive. We all take different pathways, and our journeys all unfold in different ways. I find that really kind of an antidote to thinking of a single pathway and a single destination for us all.
It's such a good question, and I might just add to what I'm hearing is I'm thinking about Lisa's presentation this morning, and it resonated with me that we're all spiritual beings, right? It's innate to the human condition. So the patient's spirituality is there. It's also in the room, but sometimes powerfully camouflaged. And Jung is so helpful around, right, that cloud cover in looking to the symptoms, right? Go right into the symptoms. Go right into the addiction or to the compulsion or to the affect that seems to erupt unbidden. And that's often where you find the sequestered mysticism or contemplative presence. And it takes a lot of patience, right, for both the clinician and the client, but it's there. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, once again, thank you for outstanding presentations over the last 2 days. I was wondering if in your clinical work, if you ever draw more explicitly from your various religious and spiritual traditions in an effort to help the patient counteract the harmful and often pathogenic effects of secular religion that's endemic in this country, and I'm talking about consumerism in particular. The idea that the path to salvation, if you will, lies through consumption of goods and services. And the pursuit of the ideal life, right, that's portrayed in our television shows, ads, commercials, and the effects of everyday people and patients in our offices being pulled in unwittingly into these secular liturgies that shape their way and our way of understanding what good life is. Right? So my question is, do you ever explicitly draw from your religious tradition in the context of psychotherapy to help the patient counteract the effects or these secular liturgies, right, and their harmful effects?
I have sometimes done that in the context of looking at contradictory messages that a client may have grown up with around that, and sometimes it comes up around, well, I'm only valued if I do this, if I accomplish X, Y, or Z. And this is the only way I will be seen as someone who is valuable, desirable, that sort of thing. And yet at the same time, they may have grown up with a very strong tradition, a religious tradition, a spiritual tradition. And so I see it as an opportunity to kind of think about that together. What did you take from what you read? And sometimes it requires my own interpretation that I share it at some point if I see that might be helpful. And I'm talking about if this is also a Hindu client that I'm working with. And so we would sort of go back and forth and think about that together and make it more of that kind of dialectical process that we were talking about yesterday, that we have a back and forth and think. And not just think, but feel, and engage with the affect that's produced in the process of discussing those contradictions. Like, where did you learn that, and why do you think, this is the only way to achieve what you want in life? So we do actually use scripture, specific scripture, and mythological stories, epics, stories from epics directly.
I think yesterday I gave the example of using biblical narratives, not in the sense of repeating the biblical narrative, but pulling out, referencing it, like Abraham or something like that. But the other way where it's probably a little more explicit is when someone thinks that they are horrible to the core, but they're also very religious, read the Bible, all of that. And I might say something, especially if they use a scripture to prove their point that they're horrible to the core. I might say something, I have no idea what we're going to do with that Genesis thing. And usually they want to know what I'm talking about. And I say that God created us, and then said, this is good. It's not that I'm trying to convince someone that they're good, but usually if I do something like that, it's a moment of wanting to drop one seed that will just tilt them a little bit back up. Because usually with that kind of sense of self, you're in it for the long haul. That's not going to be a 6-week therapy, 6-session therapy. But sometimes just a tilt back up, especially if they really believe this is how they orient their lives, then I want them to know that there's a counter message there. And then I see where that takes us. If I don't usually insert, let me put it this way, I don't begin something generally. I'm responsive, if that makes sense, to how I would use who I am. But sometimes I use who I am and I'm not aware of it. I haven't planned it. Someone might see a book in my office that sparks, Randy Sorensen's book is on my shelf, and someone saw that, which led them to talk about religion and psychotherapy. They're not in the field, but it provided a pathway, just the title, Minding Spirituality, just the title. So that would be the way I would do it. And it probably wouldn't be planned on my part. It would be spontaneous.
I found it helpful to have explicit conversations of what people hold sacred, and then to distinguish between what is kind of stated as sacred and then what's enacted as sacred. So, if I ask someone with a drug or alcohol problem, what do you hold sacred? They might say family, friends, the higher virtues, and then talk about, tell me how that's lived out in your life, which then reveals the kind of gap between the sacred as articulated and the sacred as lived, which really is kind of a way of escalating the struggle. This is a kind of motivational interviewing kind of strategy, but it's not to induce shame or guilt. It's more to explore with them, what do they in fact hold sacred, and is this, and if they're not living according to what they hold sacred, are they okay with that? And are they okay with what they're living towards? And for many people, they kind of reach a realization, I worship my drink, or I worship buying things, or I worship whatever. And it induces a kind of tension or a struggle in a good way that they're uncomfortable with. And that conversation can then shift then, how might you kind of transform your life to be able to pursue what sounds like is genuinely meaningful to you?
Well, I come away from this process convinced that we should complete this book project. That's one thing. I wasn't ambivalent about that, but I'm excited about continuing to work with you all on these ideas. I think we should think about how to find ways to be together in these kinds of spaces again. And I'm very appreciative to you as a group. This has been a long 2 days, right? And I feel like as an audience, you've done a lot of great work, asked very probing questions, stayed very attuned. And so we have 3 rounds of applause to do as we close. Right? First, I think we should thank the Jordan family. Been great to be able to connect with Merle and you all through this process, so thank you for that. And we should thank Lauren Kehoe and the administrative team. And just a slight clarification that Lauren is really the key theorist of the relational ecology idea. There's some confusion about that, some misattribution, but talk with her about that idea further. And of course, let's thank our great panel. Thank you. So
Let me
please
add
go and be
a fourth. Let me add a fourth source of a fourth object of applause, which is Steve and Brad for putting together a wonderful conference.